I'm so sorry I forgot to introduce myself. The man stepped towards us with a gaze that I can only describe as volatile. Perhaps, in the moment, he had no ill intent, but there were volcanoes behind his eyes. Volcanoes that looked ready to erupt at any damn point. For that reason, I found myself slowly backing away. But not Sandhu. For whatever reason, he stood his ground, facing the strange man without reservation. I suppose it also helped that he was 6 feet 4 inches with a considerably larger frame. "The name's Adrian Nyquist," he said, his voice nearly shaking with some kind of obscure excitement. He held out his hand, but neither of us bothered with the niceties of the introduction. He sighed. "What does it mean?" He lifted his shirt collar, taking a whiff. "Oof, you gotta shower more, Adrian," and then he started laughing again. "But can you blame me? I've been busy." "Who the heck are you?" Sandhu insisted. "And don't just tell us your name again." "Okay," Adrian said, smirking. "Big guy. Scary stuff, really. What'd you bench?" "3 plates and a bit." Sandhu opened his mouth again, but was interrupted. "It's fine, though. I'll go ahead and explain myself. I mean, the whole situation is kind of weird." "Yup," I responded. "Just kind of." Adrian sat down on the floor and let out a big puff of air. "I don't really want to go too in-depth here. I don't enjoy talking about myself. So let me drop the bomb on you first. I caused the breach." I nearly swallowed my tongue. "What? What the heck do you mean?" "I meant what I said. I let all the prisoners out." "But what?" How I stammered out. He tilted his head back and groaned before pretending to type on an invisible keyboard. "Just a little hacking, man. Nothing crazy. And they say that you'll never use the skills you learn in school in real life. PFFT." "Hacking," I responded in disbelief. "But why?" "Well, that's where it does get a little crazy. Now, have you ever hopped dimensions?" "Have I ever hacking what?" "All right, I see you're uninitiated with the concept. Well, unlike hacking some corny lock system, the logistics there really do get complicated. I'll admit that I don't 100% understand it myself, but I understand it just enough to have some fun." I was at a complete loss. "I'm a jumper. That's what they call us," he chuckled somewhat goofily. "Still a novice, but at least I'm out there doing it. Living life, you know. Anyway, the multiverse is massive, obviously. A lot of crazy worlds out there just waiting to be explored. But..." He paused. "I made a mistake last month. You see, I was watching some brutal big stakes fighting tournament called the Evisceration Championships on a planet called the Hellscape. Real hecked up place, but drugs laws are mostly unenforced there, so you know. It's all right, I guess. Anyway, I'm up in the stands. 12th row, just blitzed out of my hecking mind on Astro Coke. It's like regular Coke if regular Coke was actually good." He blew his nose into a disgusting handkerchief. "But sometimes you make some bad decisions when you're juiced. I guess school taught us something else, huh? Long story short. I made a deal with some hecking sketchy intergalactic gang leader named Bones the Fourth that I'd provide him a fighter that would guarantee him a win for the next tournament. But obviously, I was just talking shit. Not sure why the guy believed me, an Astro Cokehead of all people." He burst out laughing again. "I'll never understand the rich." "Okay," I responded, barely comprehending what I'd just been told. "Assuming that what you just said is all true, and that you're not completely hecking bonkers, why don't you just tell the guy that you don't have a fighter?" Well, Adrian made a whoopsie gesture with his hands. "The guy paid up front. A metric hecton of intergalactic currency and about 22 kilograms, 50 lbs of Astro Coke. And then, just go to him and give it back." "All right, Mr. Self-Control, teach me your hecking secrets." Look, I've blown all the money. I still have a few kilograms of coke, though, for a rainy day. I'm not sharing, by the way. So, what the hell? This whole thing's some hecked-up tournament to you. You're just gonna drag the last void standing to fight in these evisceration matches. Well, it's less of a tournament and more of a haphazard free-for-all. I'm no logistics expert, after all. I didn't know what the hell I was supposed to say to the guy. If you're behind this breach, then you're responsible for the deaths of hundreds of guards. Hundreds of good men, Sandhu coughed. Most of them good men. Adrian rolled his eyes. Yeah, okay, real loss, huh? I'm just trying to live my life here, man. You're insane. Look, did that comment get us anywhere? You feel better now after stating the obvious no reply from Sandhu. Adrian sighed. Look, can we just enjoy the show now? What's done is done. He was interrupted by Sandhu trying to tackle him to the ground. The man did know his jiu-jitsu, but no luck. He couldn't even get Adrian to budge. I saw the veins in his forehead bulging as he apparently exerted all of his strength trying to subdue the strange, lanky man. Shit, he said, through gritted teeth. This guy's strong. Adrian simply pulled out a pack of cigarette, looking completely unbothered. You know, I've taken a lot of strange drugs from a lot of different dimensions. One of them was bound to be a steroid. Also, he began grinning like a maniac. I'm no stranger to training. Wouldn't survive out there if I was weak like you guys. He picked Sandhu up by the collar and gently tossed him back. Given the circumstances, I'll forget that you just tried attacking me. Now, why don't we just sit tight and watch? I held up a hand. One last question, if you will. Adrian rolled his eyes and groaned like a child. Simon, we're missing the good shit. But fine, hurry up. The last void standing. They're bound to pretty strong, right? Adrian nodded. Stronger than you. Well, no shit. I'm not trying to grab some chump. Okay, so how the hell are you going to convince them to come with you? These prisoners aren't exactly reasonable. Adrian stared at me with just about the stupidest look on his face for around 10 seconds. Well, you know what they say, he cracked his knuckles. You just gotta live in the now. You're an idiot. Would an idiot get this far? The idiot had a point. If he really was the mastermind behind the breach, then the guy had some wicked skills. But at the same time, his common sense was close to non-existent. Whatever, I'll figure it out when the time comes, he said. In the meantime, he shot us both a rather menacing glare. Let's enjoy the damn show. I locked eyes briefly with Sandhu. I understood why he was angry. I was too. However, the situation was really beyond helping. We could only as we were told. While we'd been talking, the Nazi had defeated the Soviet, although he did suffer gruesome injuries from the bout. A portion of his gas mask had been shattered, revealing a rotting jaw underneath. In fact, his entire body had been pummeled to a near pulp as he struggled to limp along the rails. Adrian grunted. Great, we missed the World War II rematch. I hope you guys are happy with yourselves. The guy really was like a child. A really capable, psychotic child. In other news, Satan Bot had blown up Morgie, along with an entire corridor, while the surgeon had made a surprise discovery after disemboweling the spider's abdomen. It was filled with about 200 smaller humanoid spiders that began swarming him. It was hard not to shudder at the sight. Bella and Luz looked like they were still trying to find a way out, while Kale and Hugo had encountered the rowdy clown 7 feet 8 inch, 177 pounds. Rowdy really was something else. His appearance didn't just make you fear clowns and the carnival. He made you fear life itself. An impossibly tall, skinny and pale ghoul like humanoid dressed in a bloody, dirty 1960s clown costume, with twitching, twig-like fingers and cracked, red lips enveloping a mouth filled with sharp, sticky black teeth. And then there was the fact that he had no eyes and two thin, bleeding slits for a nose. I really do wonder what kind of god could have created such an entity. But he wasn't terribly strong, only being a mid-tsunami. Rowdy spat a mouthful of dark, gooey spit at Cale, dissolving the right side of his face. "Oof," Cale muttered, trying to wipe the ungodly substance away, only to pull apart bits of his flesh and muscle in the process. "Just nuke this hecking place." Rowdy began cackling like the hellish fiend he was, swinging a lead balloon attached to barbed wire right at the still-injured Hugo's head. However, Cale managed to intercept it at the last moment, breaking his own hand in the process. Suddenly, a pair of giant bat-like wings sprouted from his back. He flew towards Rowdy before drop-kicking his head clean off. "That seems like something you should have used earlier," Hugo remarked nonchalantly. "You know I would, but doing so makes me feel pretty gross." I decided to check back on the surgeon, but he was gone. "Oh, heck," I muttered, as I began seeing the black haze around me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, followed by a high-pitched, slimy voice that oozed its way into my ears. "You got me out of a real sticky situation there." Hesitantly, I looked up at the surgeon's cold, dark gaze as he grinned like a maniac down at me. And then his neck was twisted a full 360 degrees. As he dropped, Adrian let out a big breath of air, stretching out his knuckles. Guy broke the rules. No running from a fight. Besides, he was weak. Wouldn't have stood a chance in the evisceration matches anyway. "Is he dead?" I stammered out, looking down at the limp surgeon. Yeah," Adrian responded. I shook my head in disbelief. "But we've put sniper bullets through his temple. How did you?" Adrian shot me a smug grin. "Like I said, y'all are just weak. Now keep watching. Things are getting interesting." A few moments later, the Nazi came across the remnants of the spider and its hatchlings, torching them to ashes without hesitation, allowing me to breathe easier. Immediately after taking out the spider, he crossed paths with the chattering man, 5 feet 11 inch, 145 pounds, mid-earthquake tier. As much as I hated sympathizing with Nazis, the guy couldn't seem to catch a break. Resembling a horribly slouched humanoid, the chattering man was the kind of creature that parents told their kids about in an attempt to scare them into being good. Each and every one of his limbs were jagged and contorted, covered by thin, borderline translucent skin that was still inexplicably bulletproof. His eyes were covered in a damp, bloody and dirty cloth, while his long, black, matted hair swayed wildly as he twitched around. And then there were his teeth. They were giant, about twice the size of a normal human's, and coinciding with his name rapidly and constantly chattered like hell, yielding one of the most disturbing sounds imaginable. Adrian slammed his fists on the table in excitement. "Yes, this is a matchup I've been waiting to see." The chattering man stared the Nazi down, his teeth rattling together like a frenzied, demonic drum. The Nazi responded by abruptly engulfing him in a sea of flames. However, the chattering man simply walked through it completely unscathed. I could see the Nazi clench his jaw in apparent frustration. He drew his knife and rushed in, attempting to engage him up close. The chatterer was surprisingly fast, dodging each slash before biting down on the Nazi's flamethrower tank. The subsequent explosion flung them both into the air, destroying a good portion of the Nazi's back in the process. On the other hand, the chattering man only suffered a few cracked teeth. "Holy hell," I muttered. Truth be told, I'd never actually seen the chattering man in action up until that point, Perhaps we'd been low-balling him on the threat scale. The Nazi let out a hoarse scream before rushing back towards his disturbing opponent. He managed to sink his blade into the chattering man's shoulder before being blindsided by a swipe to the face, completely shattering what remained of his mask, revealing his full, zombified visage beneath. The chattering man surged his head forward, biting a large chunk of the Nazi's face off, causing spurts of dark green blood to explode everywhere. He followed it up by ripping an arm off, before savagely beating the undead Solider with his own appendage. The Nazi attempted one last stand, grabbing the knife that was still lodged inside the chattering man's shoulder, carving a large gash that extended down to his ribcage. Nevertheless, his admittedly impressive run was finally over. Not seeming to acknowledge the wound at all, the chattering man plunged two bony fists into the Nazi's chest before ripping his torso in half. Quite the gruesome display, for sure. But Adrian seemed to revel in it. He let out a raucous cheer for the victor. What the heck is wrong with this guy? I thought to myself. Tossing that thought aside, it became apparent that things were beginning to come down to the wire. Cale and Hugo had found themselves within the vicinity of the dancing guy 5 feet 7 inch, 155 pounds. He was an ordinary-looking, albeit racially ambiguous man in his mid-20s with short, light brown hair and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow dressed in a plain white t-shirt and track pants. He always wore a pair of unbranded earbuds connected to an MP3 that never seemed to run out of battery. And of course he never stopped dancing. He was a mid-asteroid, the third strongest being within the entire chasm. Hell, it's entirely possible that he actually is the strongest. We've never seen him fight against the top two, after all. So just how the hell was such an ostensibly innocuous man so dangerous? Who the hell knew? Like most of the prisoners, he was truly beyond explanation. If I had to classify him, he'd 100% be chaotic neutral. He had no conception of good or evil, no sense of right or wrong, no sense of right or wrong, no goals, no ideals. The guy just wanted to dance, and he sure as hell was a menace while doing so. Yet he would never go out of his way to bother you. You just had to stay out of his. He could disintegrate people just by touching them. He'd simply dance through your body, leaving nothing but shreds of flesh and blood behind. And if you ever tried stopping him, oh boy. You see, his eyes were always closed when he was dancing to the music funneling into his ears. If that music ever stopped, then he'd be forced to open them up. And then all hell would break loose. He'd go on a rampage until he got those earbuds back, and nothing could take him down in the process. Nothing. For that reason, it was better to leave him undisturbed, allowing him dance to his heart's content. For that reason, his holding cell was the largest, giving him plenty of room to do so. Fun fact, he listens to many genres, but his favorite is EDM, specifically melodic trance and hardstyle. But now he was out. Bad news for everybody, and Cale knew it. Shit, he muttered. We're not dealing with that. Why, Hugo asked. Is he strong? Cale nodded. More than you know. Then that's all the more reason why we need to eliminate him, Hugo said, attempting to crawl towards the dancer. But before he could make the biggest mistake of his life, Cale scooped him up and began running the other direction. Let's not do that. YEAHHHHH. The big boys are coming out. Adrian's abrupt shout nearly shattered my eardrums. I glanced over to see which monitor he was looking at, and then I understood his excitement. Satan Bot had come across his next opponent, but it wasn't one he was going to have such an easy time with. Standing opposite of him on a walkway on the very top floor was Long Wu, aka the Mechanical Menace, 6 feet 9 inch, 375 pounds. He was a mid-asteroid right in between the Calamity and the Dancing Guy in terms of estimated strength. He was actually a special case. You see, he was originally held in the Chinese equivalent of the chasm, known as the well. However, as a political favor, a complicated exchange, mind you, the US allowed the PRC to transfer Wu over. This was shortly after he'd killed 400 guards and nearly escaped entirely. They just really didn't want to deal with him anymore. He was also interesting in the sense that he wasn't born with any supernatural abilities or superhuman prowess. His danger came from his brilliant but unhinged mind and his obsession with the concept of transhumanism and being the change that shifts humanity into a new technological age. His original, progress-driven ideals could have been deemed noble at some point. But then he went off the deep end with power and decided to prove just how much better we could be once we'd fully integrated ourselves with technology. And how did he decide to do this? By trying to kill anybody and everybody he saw. His power came from his suit, which he'd apparently semi-fused with his own body. It was comprised of a dark, unidentifiable metal that had so far proved to be unbreakable. With it, he had a vast arsenal of devastatingly overpowered weapons at his disposal. Machine guns, shotguns, explosives, knives, you name it. Both of the eyes on his helmet were also capable of firing railgun blasts. But his most powerful weapon was something he called the Singularity Blade. That weapon was where the science ended and the hecked-up shit began. Being about 5 feet 152 cm long and glowing a deep ember, this sword was an enigma. I'm not sure how he made it or what he did to attain it, but it sure as hell wasn't the result of any kind of engineering. Any time that he swung it, a sharp, ear-splitting roar could be heard from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, from the tip of the blade, some kind of ghost-like serpent-esque entity would emerge, utterly annihilating everything in the area with its flames, fangs, and claws. You could only see it for about a second, and most guards were under the impression that it didn't even exist. But it does, and it's haunting. "They're going to destroy this place," Sandhu said. Adrian pulled an old-looking pack of peanuts out from his back pocket, stuffing a handful in his mouth. "You got that right," he shouted, spitting crumbs everywhere. Wu took the first offensive, unleashing a typhoon of bullets from a chain gun that jutted out from his chest. Satan Bot managed to dodge every shot, closing the distance between them in the process. Both of their movements were incredibly hard to follow, of course. Once he got close, he attempted to strike Wu with his tail, only to have it blocked by a large shield that abruptly materialized from his forearm. Wu attempted to slice the tail off with a large axe, but Satan Bot managed to evade the blow at the last second. I suddenly understood why he was so dangerous. Unlike Satan Bot, whose weapons were already fixed on its body, Wu's suit was capable of adapting to any situation, morphing its robotic appendages into whatever weapon was best suited to countering his opponent. "Jesus Christ," I muttered at the realization. This guy's a hecking monster. Even though Satan Bot had managed to dodge that strike, the next one would prove more difficult to evade. In a borderline flash-like movement, Wu threw a Muay Thai kick at Satan Bot's side, piercing it with a spike that protruded from the tip of his foot. He finished the combo by transforming his fist into a tool comparable in appearance to a meat grinder, drilling it into Satan Bot's shoulder, tearing an arm off in the process. Adrian groaned, and here I thought the devil robot was going to put up more of a fight. But he spoke too soon. After taking the hit, Satan Bot was already on the counter, whipping his tail around to strike the side of Wu's head. Wu recoiled slightly, still managing to destroy one of Satan Bot's knees with a railgun blast as he staggered. He was about to finish the job when a large cannon materialized from Satan Bot's torso. A hidden, last-stand weapon, I suppose. From the barrel, it fired out an immense blast of purple energy that Wu barely had time to dodge as it scorched the side of his helmet. It blew a gigantic hecking hole in the fortified ceiling, causing sunlight to leak in. Keep in mind that we were also about 100 feet 30 meters underground. But Wu didn't give Satan Bot any more time to reveal any further tricks, blasting its body to bits with a brutal spray from an automatic grenade launcher. It seemed as if Adrian was about to pass out from the excitement. "That S, my boy," he shouted. "Heck bones, we were going to win this whole tournament ourselves." What I hadn't noticed was Bella and Luz watching the whole encounter from behind cover. Bella's eyes lit up upon seeing the hole, a rather convenient escape route. She ran out from her hiding spot before leaping an extraordinary distance into the air, right towards freedom. But then, out of nowhere, a massive, armored hand grabbed her by the neck. From the surface, a gigantic man dressed in a streamlined mech suit of a model that I wasn't familiar with dropped down, landing hard on the walkway. He continued to nonchalantly strangle Bella as he surveyed the scene. What a mess! His booming voice reverberated through the monitors. "It's time to enforce justice." If Adrian was giddy before, he was off the rails now. They're here. They're finally here. It's time for the semi-hecking finals. "Who the hell is here?" I asked, already somewhat knowing the answer. "The Alpha Boys and Girls. The Apex Predators," he responded. "Task Force Void Nova Hammer. Task Force Void Nova Hammer." Most of the guards I knew were just dying to see them in action. I was the odd one out in that regard. Well, they were here now, and those guards were too dead to see them. I'm sorry, that really was a distasteful joke. I guess Adrian's presence has rubbed off on me just a tiny bit. Speaking of Adrian, he was feverishly fumbling around in his pockets while keeping his eyes glued on the monitor. After a few moments, he tossed a bag of white powder onto the table. "Astro Coke?" I asked. He shook his head. "Nah, just the regular stuff. The show's not at its climax yet. Gotta pace myself." He snorted the whole mound in about half a minute. "Yo," he grunted, wiping his nose off. "You fellas want to hear a secret?" I don't think we had a choice. Task Force. Void Nova. Whatever. How do you think the members get recruited? I shrugged. Dunno. Some kind of test, I guess. He guffawed. Nah, they're voids as well. My mouth dropped. As he went on to explain, TFVNH was a constantly rotating team comprised of voids save for a few exceptions who were a reasonable balance of both powerful and sane. In fact, different countries occasionally lent their own voids to one another to use for their respective forces. In exchange for their service, the members would be allowed to live freely amongst society, although they were monitored heavily while doing so. You sure know a lot of confidential stuff, Sandu said to Adrian. Just who the hell are you? Adrian sat back in the seat. Nobody, just a dabbler. A jack of all trades, master of a good handful. He sure was insufferable. In any case, I put my sights back on the monitor. As Bella struggled against the seemingly insurmountable foe, she tried blasting him with a blade spray. But before she could even raise her hand, it was broken with a single, firm grasp. Phil's depute, she spat, the life draining from her breath with every word. As Adrian would go on to tell us, this particular TFVNH member was Kente the Guillotine Sanders, 6 feet 6 inch, 287 pounds. Supposedly, he was a real hard ass. An abnormally powerful man with an incredibly skewed and strict sense of justice. To him, the word nuance meant nothing. Rehabilitation was a joke. Second chances were an alien concept. He was a man whose worldview was utterly black and white. To him, the laws that landed himself in prison didn't constitute legitimate justice. His ideals were the only ones that mattered. Cross his sensibilities, and you were a criminal in desperate need of execution. He's got a pretty notorious reputation in these parts, Adrian continued. He's captured at least 7 of the voids in here himself. Nearly killed all of them as well. Honestly, I'm not rooting for him to win. Gonna be too hard to wrangle in afterwards. Just as Bella looked about ready to pass out, Kente was blindsided by a sudden rush from Luz. Well, I guess blindsided wasn't really the right term. Kente blocked his strike with relative ease. "There's revenge customer numero uno," Adrian said. "The big guy wiped out Luz's entire village before dragging him into this place. No wonder he's pissed." For the first time, Luz had a fierce expression on his face. He let out a rage-laden shriek before digging both of his hands into the only exposed part of Kente's body, his neck, lighting up the area in his face with sparks. "Oh boy, that ain't gonna work," Adrian muttered, grinning. Kente grunted, seemingly taking the full brunt of the excessive shock without going down, before grabbing both of Luz's arms and slamming him into the floor. He dropped Bella in the process, who immediately ran off with her life. Titch, Adrian clicked his tongue in disdain. "She's not even helping him out. Guess that's women for ya." Sandhu and I kind of just glanced at each other awkwardly following the comment. Unfortunately, Luz's rage just wasn't enough for him to fulfill his revenge. While still on the ground, Kente stomped on his head, crushing it like a watermelon. Quite the gruesome sight to behold. Afterwards, he set his sights on Wu, who'd been observing the whole exchange. Finally, Adrian said, "The strong are going at it." For a moment, Wu and Kente both seemed to acknowledge each other's power, hesitating for just a moment. And then in a flash, they rushed each other simultaneously. Both of their opening moves were kicks, catching each other's respective legs mid-air, causing the walkway beneath them to crack underneath their combined pressure. On top of possessing overwhelming strength, they were both apparently skilled in martial arts as well. A terrifying combination. But Wu possessed another, more devastating aspect on top of it all. Actual weapons. Wu dropped his leg, opting to blast Kente with a flurry of shotgun rounds instead. It was enough to send him flying backwards, breaking apart the torso section of his suit. And he didn't give him a second to breathe. Wu rushed forward immediately after, grabbing Kente's helmet and slamming it down on his knee, shattering it completely. He attempted to decapitate him on the spot with a saw, but Kente caught the slash before it could land. He looked up at Wu, his dark eyes twisted with rage. He broke the saw in half before delivering a powerful-looking right cross to Wu's stomach that splintered a portion of his suit and sent him crashing into the rails. He managed to crack the damn thing, I thought, astonished at the fact. That meant at a minimum, Kente's punches packed more stopping power than an M203 grenade. "Ooh, he's getting serious," Adrian smiled. "You know what they call his striking technique?" "What?" "The pulverizing fist. He twists his knuckles at the last moment, grinding flesh to a pulp. With his strength, it's like drilling through wet toilet paper. But that's only for regular people. Doesn't work on big boys like Wu." The armor covering Kente's knuckles had shattered upon the impact. He winced in pain as he cocked it back, preparing to deliver another strike. "You're an impediment to justice," he said through gritted teeth. "Prepare to be executed." But before the two could clash again, 5 more figures jumped down from the hole that Satan Bot had created, landing in succession around Kente. "Looks like the whole gang's arrived," Adrian said. He began giving us a rundown of the other TFVNH members. First off, there was Ken, the fugitive, Ryo 6 feet 2 inch, 165 pounds. A Korean-American from Brooklyn. Not a super malicious guy. He kinda just did whatever the hell he wanted. Problem is, a lot of those things happen to be illegal. And unethical. Let's be honest. He was nonchalantly chewing tobacco as he leaned on the rails. His ability was rather interesting. Even Adrian had a hard time explaining it. Physically speaking, Ken was more or less average. However, he had the ability to summon portals from which obscure-looking but terribly powerful entities would emerge and tear apart his opponents. But at the end of the day, all that he really wanted to do was escape. He hated being monitored. Next, there was Nassar, the bloody twister, El Rafi 5 feet 9 inch, 168 pounds. He was a loan from the Saudi Arabian government. He possessed the ability to transform into a whirlwind comprised of a glass-like material, moving at speeds upwards of 120 miles per hour, along with being able to blast out deadly streams of shards at multiple targets at once. It was quite the gruesome way to go out. He was also a real weird guy. While nearly every other void assigned to TFVNH had relatively clear ambitions, his were an absolute mystery. But he probably wasn't up to anything good. His eyes were darting wildly around while a gigantic, mischievous-looking grin was plastered across his face. Next up, there was Callista, the beautiful demon tailor. 5 feet 11 inch, 121 pounds. She was a former fashion model based in Australia. Her career ended at the ripe age of 23 when she ended up suddenly murdering 4 of her fellow models, along with the police force sent to detain her. Supposedly, her abilities had been latent from birth, gradually building up to a point where she was unable to keep it in any longer. In her demon mode, her mouth would fall abnormally agape, dark rings would form around her pupils, and her body would be engulfed in cold, gray flames. At that point, she'd become intangible like a ghost and drift into her victims' bodies, causing them to bleed profusely from every orifice. But that only worked on humans. For most voids, she'd have to resort to physical brawling using her razor-like fingers. Her ambitions were fairly explicit. She just wanted to kill everybody, void or not. It begged the question as to why they'd even assign her to the force to begin with, given the fact that she was so damn volatile. Whatever. I'll never understand these people. She was staring intently at Nassar, but without any real emotion behind her gaze. It kind of just looked like she wanted to kill him for the sake of it. Continuing on, there was Clint, the normal guy Rockwell, 6 feet 1 inch, 180 pounds. Like Nassar, he was also a mystery. Supposedly, he'd never been a void at all. No otherworldly powers, abilities. Just a regular, albeit capable guy. Adrian didn't know much about him. Only that he was a special case, granted access to confidential information, and a spot on TFVNH due to a recommendation from an unnamed higher-up. In order to compensate for his lack of physical abilities, he was granted an oversized power suit dubbed the Behemoth, along with a god-slaying cannon, a heavy-duty automatic rifle that fired explosive rounds at 600 RPM. He stood still with a rather determined expression on his face, as if he had his mind set on a singular, concrete objective. Rounding out the bunch was the de facto leader of the force, Jack, the All-American, Barnes, 6 feet, 200 pounds. Like Clint, he wasn't a void either. Born in Oklahoma and belonging to a prolific family, he was an inexhaustibly skilled soldier turned government agent that managed to work his way up to the top with the help of some nepotism. Eventually, he was chosen as the inaugural subject of a project dubbed the Paragon Trials, in which government scientists would attempt to genetically engineer superhumans. Well, he wasn't actually the first, but that's what he was told for peace of mind. In any case, his trials ended up working out in the end. I guess the 8th time really was the charm. As a result, he was basically Superman, save for the flight. Genetic engineering hasn't advanced that far yet. "Man, look at those blonde curls," Adrian commented. "How the heck does he get his hair like that?" He had an arrogant grin on his face as he strolled to the front of the pack. It only took me 5 seconds of looking at him to reach the conclusion that he was probably a giant asshole. "What's the rush, Kente?" "Let's not get too excited here," Jack said. "Remember who's giving the orders, yeah?" "Your arbitrary orders mean nothing to me," Kente responded, still staring vehemently at Wu. "The only thing that matters is justice." I could see a large vein bulge out on Jack's forehead from the opposition. "Okay," he muttered, before seemingly composing himself. Let's finish the task at hand. He directed his gaze towards Wu. Simon, big guy. You lost your chance at a fair fight when you decided to become a robot psycho. While Wu may have been a match for Kente by himself, taking on the entirety of TFENH at once was a rather tall order. I guess he knew this himself as he jumped over the rails, landing on a lower floor. I'm going after him, Jack said, stepping forward. The rest of you take out the riff-raff. They want the voids alive, but I'm going to be sorely disappointed if you don't bring me back some heckin' minced meat. That was one thing him and Kente could agree on. And remember, he said, turning back. His expression was suddenly teeming with fury. You're all scum heck piece of shit voids as well. You try to escape, try to heck with me, and you're going to be begging for me to end your pathetic hecking lives. He pointed at Ken. You stay here. Make sure nobody tries escaping through the roof. Instead of acknowledging the order, Ken just spat his tobacco into a plastic bottle. Hey, you listening to me, you hecking Jap? Remember when we beat you in the hecking war? Isn't he Korean? Clint muttered. Ken just raised an eyebrow at the remark. Dude, I don't even know how to respond to that. Look, whatever, just hecking listen to me. All right, Jack screamed. Ken grinned sarcastically and made a defensive gesture. Okay, boss. Jack's forehead vein bulged out even more. It was really starting to look pretty gross. All right, let's hecking go then. After finishing his motivational speech, he jumped down, presumably going after Wu. Save for Ken, the rest of TFENH followed suit, scattering throughout the chasm in search of the remaining voids. The strong were finally about to converge on one bloody path. As dark, weird, and gruesome as the whole situation was, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at least a little bit excited to see what was about to transpire. Part 6. God, I can't even keep my eyes still, Adrian said, beaming at the prospect of utter carnage ahead. My eyes ended up drifting towards the dancing guy, who was jubilantly performing the shuffle along a second-floor walkway. Soon enough, he crossed paths with Nassar, who was grinning like a madman. Without much hesitation, he stepped forward, heading right towards the dancer. Well, I guess it's over for him, I said. I had yet to hear about anybody being able to inflict any kind of damage against the dancing guy. The only thing that we could really do was contain him, and I severely doubted that things were going to be any different here. I'm not so sure, Adrian responded. The guy's a wild card. I think he's just testing the waters here. Before I knew it, Nassar had gotten dangerously close. I held my breath in anticipation. There's no way, I thought. And I was right. Nassar tried to strike the dancer but was blitzed immediately. I could hardly even comprehend what had even happened. One moment, he was in the midst of throwing a right cross. The next, he was planted firmly within the concrete wall, missing an arm and with a gaping hole in his chest. Holy shit, he spurted out. He looked towards the dancer, still inexplicably grinning. Damn, you're strong. What the hell's wrong with him, I wondered out loud. Nothing. Nothing at all, Adrian answered. I think I found a kindred spirit. Nassar pulled himself out of the crater he'd made, displaying zero indication that he was in any kind of pain at all. Suddenly, a flurry of glass engulfed his chest wound and missing arm, reverting them back to normal in a matter of seconds. He stretched himself out before nodding happily at the dancer and walking off. What the heck? I thought. I looked over at Santu, wanting to see his own reaction, but he was stone-like, staring at only one monitor in particular. I followed his eyes and realized that for whatever reason he was focused on the kid who was still sitting in his cell. Check it out, my thoughts were broken by Adrian's outburst. She's found her prey. I looked at the monitor he was gesturing to, seeing Kale and Hugo being hacked away at by Callista. "Now who the hell is she?" Kale shouted, taking a sequence of gnarly gashes to the chest. "Evil incarnate," Hugo answered. Although still severely injured, he was able to move around on his own now. "Look at her eyes. She's being controlled by the devil." Callista drilled her hand forward, impaling Kale through the solar plexus. He chopped at her arm before pushing her off. "Hecking hell," he sighed. "This is back-breaking work." "Are you a match for her?" Hugo asked. Kale shook his head, exhausted as hell. "Doubt it." "In that case," Hugo said, standing up, "it seems like I'll have to detach myself fully." "What the hell are you talking about?" "My constraints were only lifted halfway the last time." "You almost died last time as well. You sure you're going to make it out this time?" "I'm not planning to." Kale chuckled. "Sorry, but I'm not going to let you do that." Hugo's eyes began glowing a familiar crimson. "I've been ordained a holy mission. I'll do whatever it takes." He stared at the rapidly approaching Callista. "Anything to eliminate evil." His scars began glowing again, brighter than ever this time, preparing to engage the oncoming enemy. But before they could clash, Kale stepped in between and tanked another series of slashes before kicking her back. "Ah," he grunted. "Heck, that hurt." "What are you doing?" Hugo asked, perplexed. "I told you this is." Yeah, you're God-given. Whatever the heck. I don't know, buddy. You're a psycho. But for whatever reason, I don't really want you to die." Kale gave him a bloody grin. "It feels like we've been through a lot, you know." For a moment it seemed as if Hugo was at a loss for words. But then Callista stood back up. "I see," he said. "But what are we going to do about her?" Kale looked down and sighed. "Shit. Yeah, that's the real question, ain't it?" Kale clenched his teeth as Callista began charging at them once again. "Looks like Lady Luck's on their side today," Adrian said. I realized what he meant when one of Callista's hands were bitten straight off by the chattering man, who'd strolled into the fray from an adjacent corridor. "Well, shit," Kale said, watching the two suddenly preoccupied with each other. "Looks like God is looking out for us." He grinned at Hugo, who simply nodded back. As those two got the heck out of Dodge, Callista and the chattering man began relentlessly butchering each other. Using her remaining hand, she made 2 quick slashes in succession, tearing open his chest and forehead. In response, the chatterer bit a good portion of her shoulder off. This went on for a few minutes, until about half of Callista's body remained and about 90% of the chatterer's skin had been shredded off, staining the entire area a gory red. But even demonic superhumans had their limits. They were both beginning to slow down. Callista twisted her bloody, knife-like fingers, pushing them into the chattering man's mouth and through his throat. While it was still lodged inside, she threw her arm upwards, splitting his head apart. But at the exact same time, the chattering man swiped at her head, twisting her neck clean off. They both fell simultaneously, as combatants who fought to the bloody end. It was by far the most brutal bout I'd seen thus far, although there was certainly some fierce competition for that title. I decided to check back on the voids that were still contained. The Titan was still in his cell. The Calamity's light also remained green. The kid hadn't stepped out either. But then, there was the warden. Clint had stepped into his cell, donning the behemoth suit in all of its destructive glory. Wearing it brought them roughly up to the same size. Still, he was just an ordinary guy going up against an unfairly powerful monster. Unless he had some tricks up his sleeve, this was about to get really messy really quick. "Hey," he said, grinning at the warden through his fortified visor, "you've been chasing me all this time. Thought I'd finally come to you instead." Sounds like they have unfinished business, Adrian said. That much was probably true. Still staring down at the blood-stained floor, the warden simply let out a deep, lengthy sigh. When he finally looked up, there was nothing in his pit-like eyes but sheer rage. Your death won't be quick. His voice was deeper than the Marianas. Before Clint could even get his guard up, he was brutally blitzed by a sudden rush. The warden was moving so fast he was effectively a blur. Clint was launched backwards, denting a metal wall. The warden bolted at him again, slashing off pieces of his suit with nothing but his fingers. He launched his fist at Clint's protective visor, smashing it to bits and cutting his face up with bits of stray glass in the process. However, Clint managed to push him off before it could connect with his skull, which would have been beyond fatal. Heck, he spat, attempting to unsheath the oversized blade at his side. But he wasn't nearly quick enough. The warden grabbed it by the edge before Clint could even swing, shattering it into fine dust with nothing but a firm grasp. Then he grabbed the suit by the arm, slamming Clint hard onto the ground, causing him to spit out blood. Shit, Adrian muttered. This is even hard for me to watch. The warden proceeded to uncompromisingly wail away on top of him, with Clint barely managing to protect his face with the suit's wrist guards. But even those were being chipped away at rather quickly. Just as there was about an inch of suit left covering his arms, he tilted his elbow towards the warden's neck, firing off a small grenade that caused the overpowered void to stagger just a little. The warden retreated, touching the small wound that the explosion had left under his chin. In turn, Clint struggled to pull himself up, with his suit looking like it had been run over by about a dozen freight trains. His face was covered in blood and cuts, while a blood vessel had popped in his right eye. Yet he shot the warden a gory smirk. Okay, maybe I deserve that. But the comeback starts now. He opened a compartment on the suit's ribcage, taking out something that resembled a small white crystal. Remember these, he asked, before using it to cut himself on an exposed portion of his wrist. The warden's face twisted into an unfathomable expression of fury. He rushed forward again, tackling Clint into another wall, before ripping off a large chunk of the suit's torso. And then, he drilled his fist into Clint's ribcage. At that moment, I was 100% sure he was done for. But, to my downright surprise, he managed to tank the punch, grimacing only slightly. "What do you think?" he asked the warden, still grinning. "We ran some experiments. These shards are new and improved." The warden let out an ear-splitting shriek that I was surprised didn't deafen Clint on the spot, before picking him and tossing him back into the cell. He followed him in, picking his head up and bashing his temple about 10 times into the metal toilet seat, before it ended up breaking from the force. As a result, one side of Clint's face was beginning to resemble a bloody mush. Still, I was surprised it hadn't been reduced to pulp. What the hell was that shard? I thought to myself. He also seemed to have picked up a bounce in his step, evading another strike from the warden and crawling behind him. At that point, the behemoth had effectively been reduced to scrap metal. Clint dove towards the god-slaying cannon, which had been knocked loose during their scuffle. He scooped it up and began spraying it at the warden's direction. However, he managed to evade just about every shot, leaving large clouds of smoke and dust behind him as the devastating bullets reduced the place to rubble. "Heck, you're a tough customer," Clint groaned as he flipped a switch on the weapon. "Take this, then." The barrel of the weapon suddenly grew in size, causing it to resemble an actual cannon. As he pulled the trigger, the monitor darkened for just a moment before a flash of deep red engulfed the area, and a high-pitched staccato of wholly unfamiliar noises assaulted my senses. I kept watching as the recoil from the strange blast pushed Clint's back into the wall as it completely annihilated the entire other side of the room. The weapon itself was also destroyed in the process. I guess the god-slaying cannon got an upgrade, 'cause I sure as hell didn't know it could do that. After the smoke cleared, everything was silent for a few moments. Clint grinned, letting out a big sigh of relief. And then his face dropped a few seconds later. As the rubble began stirring, the warden burst out, with about half of his entire body now charred to hell. He also had a wicked, psychotic grin on his face. It was the first time I'd seen him make any kind of overt expression at all. I could have lived without it, though. "You took everything from me," he said, walking ominously towards the nearly broken Clint. "But I have to admit, this has been a hell of a fun time." "Son of a bitch," Clint groaned, reaching into his pant leg pocket. He pulled out 2 syringes filled with black and blue liquids respectively. "Simon painkillers. Don't let me down," he muttered, before injecting the blue. But just as he was about to inject the black, the warden clutched his hand, crushing it along with the syringe. "More tricks," he sneered, his eyes wild as all hell. "I guess that's what the weak resort to." Clint simply laughed. "You're not so smart when you're angry, huh? It's in my blood now." The warden released the grip, revealing Clint's bloody, cut up and mangled hand. However, the black substance was already seeping into his wounds. "What is that?" the warden asked. "A gift from a good friend. Also, my last resort. Didn't want to use it now, but I guess I'm out of options." In a matter of seconds, nearly all of Clint's wounds had healed up. Along with that, his muscles had become visibly tensed. "That's impossible," the warden gritted his teeth. "That's one thing I've learned," Clint responded, smiling wide as he stepped forward. "Nothing's really impossible." He stepped forward, throwing a hard strike at the warden's chest, sending him crashing back into the rubble. Clint looked down at his fist in surprise. "Nice," he grinned. But he had no time to appreciate his newfound power. The warden rose back up like a wild animal in frenetic pursuit of its prey. "You weak," he boomed. "I'll never lose to you. Nature won't allow it." Clint chuckled. "You're right. I am weak. Must suck for your ego, huh?" The warden shrieked before charging back at Clint. Once there, they engaged in a fierce exchange of blows, rocking the place to its core. While Clint's physical attributes had been enhanced greatly by whatever serum he'd taken, there was still an evident gap in strength between them, with each of the warden's blows ostensibly packing more force than his own. However, he did have one advantage. He was clearly trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat, while the warden was an amateur at best. He dodged a series of haymakers before countering with a flurry of jabs and kicks of his own. At that point, the warden's mannerisms had devolved into that of a feral creature's, fueled solely by combative impulse. Yet, I could see the same wicked grin creeping in throughout his wild rage. He was undoubtedly enjoying the adrenaline. The warden picked Clint up by the waist, slamming him into the wall and then onto the ground. He then mounted him, unleashing a series of hammer fists that Clint was forced to excruciatingly block with his forearms. Soon enough, his skin began to tear off from the punishment. While on the ground, Clint managed to throw a kick that connected with the warden's hip. However, he hardly got any reaction out of it. He simply wasn't strong enough. Instead, the warden threw both fists down onto Clint's ribs. I could hear them crack through the monitor. He grimaced in pain. But the warden didn't give him a moment to recuperate. He drilled a fist right into the side of his face. A spurt of blood and a few teeth flew out of his mouth as his head was cranked to the side. "He's got to be hecking done for," Adrian commented. I had to share the sentiment. Clint's efforts were more than admirable. He sure as hell put a better fight than I could have ever hoped to. But even with all of his tools, tricks, and skills, he was still no match. At least. That was what I genuinely believed. But the guy was just full of surprises. After taking another brutal strike to the shoulder, Clint managed to somehow escape out from underneath. I couldn't even fathom what kind of move he pulled in order to do so. And then, in a series of moves that would make the most prolific jiu-jitsu practitioners light up with glee, he engaged the warden in a vicious grappling match on the ground. From his face, I could tell that he was going far above and beyond his own limits. It was down there where the warden's weakness really became clear as day. He had no idea what to do. After an entire minute of relentless, excruciating struggle from both combatants, Clint managed to get the warden into a beautiful D-arse choke. As the warden struggled feverishly to escape, Clint's face was wrought with sheer determination. The warden changed his tactics, opting to pound at Clint's already broken ribs in an attempt to cause him to break his hold. That was a bad decision. It only allowed Clint to get his hold even tighter. Despite all of the egregious punishment he'd taken, Clint never relented. Soon enough, the warden's movements began slowing down. And then, he stopped moving altogether. Even then, Clint didn't release his grasp. He held the warden's neck in place, using all of his strength for about 4 minutes before he finally let go, all while gasping in accumulated pain and exhaustion. The guy really looked as if he was going to die on the spot. But that didn't matter to him. The fight was finished, and an unlikely victor had emerged. With a tired grin on his face, he raised a shaky fist in victory before passing out himself. "Well, I'm hecking touched," Adrian said. "It's like watching Rocky all over again." On another monitor, Bella had made her way back to the top floor, back to the gaping exit. "Wow. What a pleasant surprise," Ken said, standing in her way. She seemed to share the surprise as they stared at each other. "Is this a joke?" she responded. Ken shrugged. "Where else was I going to see you?" "Are you going to let me go?" she asked. "If I did, then American boy would track me down and kick my. I gotta wait till he dies first. Then we can go off into the sun together," he smiled. "In the meantime, you want to talk for a bit?" She sighed. "What do you think's going on here?" "I don't know," Ken responded. "That's up to you. You already know how I feel. I tried to assassinate you. You were contracted to assassinate me by a massive dickhead. I'm sure it was nothing personal." "Oh my God," she sighed again. "Besides," Ken continued, "I'm still alive. Maybe you really didn't want to kill me. That's what I tell myself anyway." "You're insane if you think anything's going to happen between us. You think I want to date anybody right now?" "Well, I never wanted to either, until I met you." A period of silence followed. "Let's face it," Ken spoke up. "We're bad people living bad lives. Don't you get tired of it?" "Speak for yourself," Bella responded. "You know what kind of people I kill." "I'm not talking about that. You want to escape, don't you?" "I don't belong in here." "A lot of people don't." "What are you getting at?" "I'm pretty sure you know." "The kid." "Yeah, what about him?" Ken exhaled. "Look, forget about dating. But don't you ever feel like doing something good for once? Doing something for anybody besides yourself?" Bella simply rolled her eyes in response. "I'm sorry, that came out badly." She stepped forward, brushing past him. "I'm leaving now. If you want to try and stop me, then go ahead. I'll just kick you." Again. There was another pause before Ken shook his head. "You know I'm not going to do that." "Good," she began walking off. "I'm not tired of anything," by the way, she said without turning around. "I'm in control of my own life. and I kind of enjoy that." She left Ken looking somewhat melancholic. But eventually, he began smiling again. "Of course you do." He took off, abandoning his post. But I'm sure he hardly cared about that. "Well, geez, that was a downer," Adrian said. "Let's get back to the exciting stuff," he grinned. "The final chips are starting to fall into place." Jack had finally found Wu. "You China's secret weapon, or something?" he asked, approaching the mechanical menace, who remained silent. "Doesn't matter," he continued, clenching his fists. "America's always on top. Look up there as well." I turned to the monitor that Adrian was gesturing towards, watching as Kente continued roaming the corridors, still clenching his teeth in justice's driven rage. Actually, no, he wasn't roaming anymore. He was walking towards somebody. But at first I couldn't recognize who it was. "Come at me, you hecking." But I did recognize the voice. It was Senju, his head now resembling a glowing, floating skull shrouded in a dark haze. "Didn't he?" Dai asked, confused. Adrian chuckled. "Don't you know anything about the Wraith style? One of its core proponents is the revival technique." Of course, I thought. How could I not know that? "You killed everybody at my hecking dojo," Senju screamed at the approaching Kente. "You re-dead." Kente bit down even harder, cracking his own teeth. "I simply enacted justice, and I've waited for too long to finish the job." "Man, how lucky were we to find this place," Adrian said. "Crisp hecking front row seats." It took me a moment to process the implications of what he'd just said. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked him. In turn, he looked at me like I was insane. "What do you mean? Didn't you build this place?" He shook his head. "Well, if you didn't, then who?" My eyes wandered up to Sandhu, whose attention was still firmly planted on the kid. "He's the one that led me into this room to begin with." I do remember thinking it was rather strange, but with everything that had been going on, I forgot to question it further. But now I couldn't avoid it. "What the hell is going on?" "Matt." "Now even I'm confused," Adrian said, before turning to Sandhu. "What's going on here? Who the hell are you?" "Yeah, that's a good question," I added, also looking in his direction. "Simon, man. I've known the guy for years, yet I couldn't begin to understand what he was planning here." Sandhu took a while to respond, and even then, it was less than satisfying. "It's complicated," he finally spoke up. "By the way, aren't you guys missing the show?" I wasn't going to force the guy to talk. Over the years, I've learned that doing so only leads to disingenuous answers. Besides, he was right. Jack was already rushing towards Wu. "Simon Wu, show me your kung fu shit. I'll beat you down with good old American boxing." "He really thinks Americans invented boxing." "Ha," Adrian muttered. Instead, Wu opted to blast him back with his hand shotgun. Jack was sent flying into a support beam, demolishing it in the process. While he'd taken no ostensible damage, there were now holes littered across the American flag printed on his chest plate. That sure got him pretty rattled. "Oh, you hecked up buddy," he said, a deranged smirk drawn across his face. For the first time ever, Wu decided to speak. "What did you think was going to happen?" In an instant, they charged at each other. Given their respective power and speed, their combined movements were hardly comprehensible. But if I had to approximate the exchange, it went something like this. Jack lands across to Wu's helmet, cracking it slightly. Wu attempts to stab Jack with a large blade. It breaks on his arm. Jack presses forward, throwing a flurry of jabs at Wu's head. Most of them are blocked. Wu counters with a kick to the ribs. It hurts Jack. Wu uses his railgun eyes, burning the side of Jack's cheek. And then the gauntlet is unleashed. Wu lands a brutal combination with steel-studded knuckles. Wu shoves a grenade into Jack's face. Wu pounds away at Jack's ribs with a spiked bat. Wu stabs Jack through the shoulder with an elbow blade. Wu snaps one of Jack's fingers off. Wu headbutts him. Wu picks him up and executes a hard takedown, destroying the walkway they're standing on and causing them to fall to a lower floor. And then Wu begins strangling Jack. He's got the advantage with his weapons, I said. There's no way Jack's turning it around. Adrian scoffed. The US didn't funnel billions into this guy for nothing. He's got a few tricks up his sleeve. And oh boy, did he ever. A GGHHHH Jack was frenetic as he struggled to break out of Wu's iron grasp. Get lost. He screamed before his right fist began glowing red. He let go of Wu's wrists, ramming his knuckles right into his throat instead. The first significant strike. I could see Wu's armor splinter as he was launched backwards, forced to release his grip. Still exasperated from the struggle, Jack pulled himself up, his fists smoldering like hell. At the same time, Wu was gasping for air himself. How's that, he said, holding his fist up while grinning like a man utterly unhinged. Suddenly, his left fist also began glowing, the only difference being that it was blue. It's about to get hecking gnarly, Jack said. The stars and stripes style is immeasurable. What followed was an exchange of blurs. I could hear explosive bouts of clanking metal. White smoke and flickering sparks intercut with flashes of red and blue from Jack's fists. Two individuals at the pinnacle of power striking each other with everything that they had. After around an entire minute of hectic but incomprehensible fighting, both men had sustained significant damage. Wu's suit was covered in cracks and dents, with his right forearm and left thigh now exposed. There was also blood leaking through his fractured helmet. On the other hand, hardly an inch of Jack's body was unscathed. He was cut and swollen all over, with one of his eyes stabbed out and his right shoulder grated down to the bone. They stared each other down during their few seconds of fleeting recuperation. And then they were right back at each other's throats. Wu attempted to blast Jack in the face with his palm cannon, but the American managed to weave underneath the shot, throwing both fists into Wu's chest, causing his suit to shatter completely at that particular spot. His vitals were now exposed. Jack knew what kind of opportunity he'd just created, indicative by the wicked grin on his face. In a matter of milliseconds, Jack pulled back one of his fists and struck Wu directly. Without his armor protecting him, that blow must have liquidized his insides. In any case, that's what I got from his reaction. In an instant, he collapsed in pain before being tossed over the rails onto an even lower floor. As he clutched his sides in excruciation on the ground, Jack leapt down and stomped on his helmet, finally shattering that as well. He'd accomplished something that even the most sophisticated of weaponry would have had trouble doing. In a desperation move, Wu pulled out his shotgun and began spraying it upwards, forcing Jack to retreat. Feeling pain that must have eclipsed the boundaries of unbearable, he pulled himself up, finally revealing his cut-to-hell visage through his broken helmet. "You're just a regular person underneath that suit," Hey Jack said, panting. "How comical." "You were too." Before the experiment, Wu responded. Jack scoffed. "Is that what you think? That I'm just like you? A regular hecking guy?" "Yes," Wu responded. "We weren't born special." Jack shook his head. "Why does that matter? Look, I'll give you one thing. You're strong. Hell, you even gave me a bit of a hard time. But your attitude is hecking bullshit." Wu had trouble responding to that. "Sure, we weren't born special," Jack continued. "But we've changed ourselves. Clawed our way up to the top." He paused for a moment. "No, you're not just a regular guy underneath that suit after all. And I wasn't just another heck in the crowd before the experiment. They just don't choose any random asshole. You know, these are things that we've accomplished ourselves. Things that nobody else could do. Why don't you hecking understand that?" Another pause followed. The silence was broken when Wu reached over his shoulder, pulling out a terribly large red-orange sword, the Singularity Blade. "Jack Barnes," he began. "You seem unintelligent on the surface, but you've almost said something profound just now." Jack smirked at the pseudo-compliment. "You're strong as well," Wu continued. "I'll show you my respect by cutting you down with my ultimate weapon." "I'm touched," Jack responded. "I guess I'll have to show you the same courtesy." He closed his eye for a moment, before opening it back up, revealing nothing but white underneath his lids. The red and blue radiating off his fists began extending up to his forearms, before quickly enveloping each side of his body entirely. "You should be honored. I'm about to crush you with the full force of my American spirit." Two tremendously strong men, both now at the pinnacle of their own power, stood across from each other in full acknowledgement of each other's prowess. An earth-shaking clash was about to ensue. Wu went first, swinging the blade and releasing an obscure serpentine entity from its tip. It rushed forward with torrid speed, latching its claws onto Jack's arms and attempting to bite his head off. Jack responded by drilling his fist down the creature's throat. It bit down, puncturing his arm but shattering its own teeth in the process. Jack and the creature fought brutally and relentlessly, with the latter seemingly growing in size as the battle endured. However, Wu himself was standing still. What's he doing? Why isn't he going after him? I thought out loud. He can't, Adrian responded. Look closely at him. It took me a second, but I understood. The punch that Wu had taken to the chest had essentially put him out of commission. In fact, at that moment he was struggling to even stand up. He was relying on the Singularity creature to get the job done. After some minutes, the beast had grown to an ungodly size, resembling some kind of colossal, ghoul-like dragon. It bit down on Jack's arm once again, taking it clean off this time. Jack shrieked in endurance-fueled pain, headbutting one of the dragon's eyes out in response. It roared in pain as it whirled backwards, utterly annihilating its surroundings. It even took out a few cameras. Jack took the opportunity to reel in the frenetic beast, jumping up on its head and bashing away. Despite having half of its face caved in, the dragon still managed to fling him into a wall, ramming what remained of its head into his torso moments later. A wave of blood busted from Jack's mouth before his lips curled back into a sadistic, unrelenting grin. He punched the creature's remaining eyes out before getting on top of it and rendering the rest of its head into a ghostly mush with nothing but his remaining fist. Just like that, the battle was over. As the dragon died, the blade shattered with it. Jack leapt down, back in front of Wu. He half chuckled, half groaned as he limped towards him. Lost an arm. Lost an eye. You really put me through the gauntlet, hey. Wu's expression was stone for a while. But it eventually tuned into a grin. No malice behind it. He was simply acknowledging the interminable fighting spirit that Jack had put on display. Well, looks like my fate's been sealed, he said. Jack reciprocated the grin, breathing heavy through his teeth. Gotta say, you weren't a pushover. But in the end, America always wins. He finished Wu off with a quick strike to the head. As the mechanical menace dropped, Jack's body stopped glowing, and he began staggering away, his movements strained and delirious. In any case, he didn't make it too far. He dropped about 10 paces from Woo-Woo. That was fun, he muttered, slowly drifting off into the darkness. Even in death, his grin didn't waver. Hecking hell, Adrian said. Did they both have to die? Well, let's see if one of these other weirdos can make it out alive. I'd been so invested that I nearly forgot about the other fight that was going on. I turned my head, watching as Kentei effortlessly strangled Senju. I killed your master with 3 strikes, and you're even weaker than him. Your effort is an insult. I'm going. Hacking. Kill. Kentei struck the side of Senju's jaw and slammed his neck onto the ground, interrupting his sentence. I guess we'll never know what he was about to say. A real mystery there. But despite the overwhelming power gap, Senju kept rushing back at him, only to get abruptly beat down every single time. Shit, he shouted in frustration, after taking another punch to the chest. Stop evading justice, Kentei said. Your time's done. But then an unexpected figure arrived on the scene. Hugo rushed into the frame, directing his own rush of blows at Kentei. However, he reacted to them in the same way a regular man would have reacted to a mosquito bite. Hugo was subsequently knocked back, without much explicit effort on Kentei's part. His scars were glowing like hell as he pulled himself back up, his eyes pursed with piercing fury. Why's he so pissed off? I thought to myself. Kale arrived moments later, yelling after Hugo. What the hell are you doing? I know you're crazy, but what the heck, he shouted. He's the one that killed my mentor, Hugo said, his voice shaking. The last good man on this earth, destroyed by the same evils he attempted to help. But he was foolish. There can only be response to the sin in this world. This hecking shit killed my master as well, Senju said, turning to Hugo. Let us bury him. Hugo sighed, clearly not excited at his prospective ally. Man, Kale said, staring up at Kentei. This isn't fun anymore. All 3 of them tried attacking at once. No luck. Kentei tanked each blow before striking each of them down in rapid succession. He grabbed Kale by the neck before tossing him at Senju, sending them both crashing into the wall. Shit. Kale yelled as he struggled to pull himself up. Yo, priest, what level of detachment are you at? Hugo exhaled. 99%. Damn. Kale muttered, looking up at the steadily but menacingly approaching Kentei. So we're hecked. Not necessarily. I'm about 10 times stronger at 100% than I am at 99. I'm not sure the math checks out there, Hugo said, before taking another strike to the stomach. No matter, Hugo said. One of the biggest evils stands before us. Every measure must be taken. You're gonna... hecking. Kale uttered, being kept on his toes by repeated blows from Kentei. Hugo's eyes flickered a deep red. Almost like a literal fire was behind them. We're going to die regardless. Kentei turned away from Kale and turned to Hugo. He squinted. Now I remember you. Hugo threw a cross so hard that it seemed to split the air molecules in its path. Despite managing to block it, Kentei was still blasted backwards. Skidding to a stop, he held his arm up, which had been badly mangled from the blow. He sneered at Hugo, his eyes growing crazier with every second that passed. Evil must be eliminated. You're in no position to make that call, Hugo responded. They bolted at each other. The 2 traded blows, with Hugo slowly but surely overwhelming Kentei. Kale could only watch in awe. Senju, on the other hand. Yeah, kick his hecking ass. But the more damage that Kente took, the more wild he seemed to get. Hugo landed a 1-2 to his jaw and temple, drawing blood from his head, before finishing the combination by drilling a knee into his liver, nearly causing Kente to buckle on the spot. "Why did you kill him?" Hugo spat at Kente in between strikes. He was the last chance at salvation that this disgusting world had. Now bruised, bloody and battered, Kente dropped to one knee. Hugo stepped in for the finishing blow. Or what I thought was going to be the finishing blow. Kente managed to catch the strike, surprising just about everybody watching. His forehead veins bulged as he looked up at Hugo, his face twisted in an inconceivable expression of demented wrath. "I killed him because he stood in the way of justice." In a split second, Hugo was knocked backwards, having his chest completely caved in. What he wheezed out as he bent over, trying to funnel air into his lungs. "He's stronger. Be careful." Kente picked him up and judo slammed over the rail before he could get the sentence out. I never cringed as hard as I did while watching his spine get instantaneously bent into the worst possible shape. Hugo Kale yelled, charging at Kente. A valiant but fruitless effort. He was picked up and brutally rag-dolled into the walls and floors. Kente finished the ruthless display by slamming his back into the wall. Kale crumpled like a pancake, with every bone in his body just about broken. Recovering from that was going to be a tall order. "Shit," he spurted out, unable to make another move. Suddenly, Senju was back on his own, heavily injured, and looking far less confident than he was before. "We can't let him win," Sandhu said, his expression a combination of frightened and resolute. "Oh, you're not watching the kid anymore." "What a surprise," Adrian said. I shook my head. I mean, what the hell are we supposed to do? Instead of answering my question, he just brushed by me, before abruptly sprinting out the door. "What the hell, man?" I called after him. No use. He was already gone. I fumbled around in place for a moment. On one hand, I really didn't want to go out there, but on the other, he was my friend, and I wanted answers. I also wanted to make sure he didn't do something he wasn't going to have the chance to regret. After a few moments of frenetic contemplation, I found myself chasing after him. "Where heck are you guys going?" I could hear Adrian calling out from behind me. At that point, he was the least of my concerns. Chills ran down my spine as I traversed across the blood-stained halls decorated by the mangled corpses of my former guards. It was a sight that I'd experienced in my nightmares before. I'm sure just about every guard had. Seeing it in real life was jarring, to say the least. It sure had been one hell of a day. But the inevitable dusk finally seemed to be closing in. That's not the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down what do you think will happen next. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing so you may not miss any video in future.